Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Laser i3 Teacher Webinar Series. My name is Kyle Demers Johnson with the Laser i3 project at the Smithsonian Science Education Center. I will be moderating tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is the fifth in our six-part series, and the subject is Moving Assessment from the Dessert Menu to the List of Entrees. The SSEC and the Laser i3 team would like to thank the U.S. Department of Education and our match funders for supporting the Laser i3 project and making this webinar possible. Neither the U.S. Department of Education nor our private sector funders are responsible for the content of this webinar. We'll start with quickly going over some housekeeping. All participants will remain muted throughout the webinar. The GoToWebinar software tracks your attendance and participation in it. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website. You can see the website's URL on your screen in front of you. Please use the questions feature in the webinar software, which is located in the software's toolbar. I've added a screenshot of that toolbar here. You'll see how questions will be displayed and how answers will appear back. Note that I recorded this image on a Mac, so your interface may look slightly different, but the function and layout should be more or less the same. Your questions can be technical if you're experiencing problems with the software, or content questions about what is being discussed. If you prefer, you may also email my coworker Kayla Mallon, whose email address is mallonk@si.edu. That's MALLONK@si.edu. We really would like a high level of participant involvement with this webinar, so please do ask questions as they come to you. There's also going to be a separate tool for audience participation, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Chris Demers. Chris is the assessment coordinator for the Concord School District in Concord, New Hampshire. He taught for 9 years in the elementary school he attended as a child before coming to Concord to coordinate the elementary science program. After a few years of this work, he served his first tour of duty as assessment coordinator. He was then thrilled to return to the classroom to teach 5th grade for a year and then as an assistant principal for several years. Chris has also served as a media tech integrator and is now back in the assessment coordinator's chair. He has published a few articles, primarily on assessment, and has presented locally, regionally, and nationally. But as he says, he mostly likes staying home so he can ride his bicycle. So without further ado, Chris, I'm going to pass the controls over to your computer.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm already getting a message here to show my screen. Hopefully I'm doing everything right. Kyle, you'll let me know if I make a mistake, I hope.
And we see it now.
Okay, great. So thank you again, everybody, to my friends on the East Coast who are with me here on this side of the country. Thanks for staying extra late after school. I'll try to make this worthwhile. There's a fair amount of hypocrisy as I think about talking about responding to data in the moment as we teach, which is the theme for this presentation. As I think about how we're delivering this message now, I'm a theater guy. I do a fair amount of community theater, and we're up on stage collecting data all the time. And so when I'm not teaching in front of kids, I'm performing in front of adults. And everything I do, I tend to try to read the audience. And so as you're sitting there, wherever you may be, and your eyes are rolling back in your head because I'm speaking too fast, I won't know that. And if you're twisting in your chairs as I'm moving too slowly, I won't know that either. So I will do my best to speak to you today about responding to your learner by not responding to you at all. But I will do my best. And actually, we have a couple of things built into our presentation today that will give you a chance to throw your hat into the ring, starting right off with the use of a tool called Socrative or Socrative, depending how you pronounce it. I'm going to go with Socrative. And Socrative is a tool that we've used quite a bit here in Concord, and for our beginning with this work, we're going to complicate things for you a little bit and ask you to jump out of the browser window that you're in now, and hopefully this will work, and launch a new tab. And I know that I have put in the link to the tool that I would like you to go to in the chat box. So if you have access to that, you should be able to find this link that you're seeing up on the screen here, this besocrative.com login. And if you get to that page, it should look a little bit like this. This is the student login for this response tool that we're going to use, and hopefully this will work. And Kyle will throw that into the chat box if I did not do it correctly. But I see it there on my end, so hopefully you do too. So the idea is I would like to toss a question out there. And so you're going to log in as a student would. A student could use this tool on either an iPad, an iPhone, or a computer. It is a web-based tool, and as I mentioned, there are apps for that. And so if you can get over to that page to join my classroom, my virtual classroom, you're going to type in the student login, MRD, Mr. D, 23. And if you join that room, if you click on join that room, then hopefully on my end, as a teacher, I'm going to flip over tabs here and show you what the teacher interface looks like. You will hopefully be able to join my classroom. We'll see if this works. I can see that we have 7 people in there already, including myself. And so what I'm going to do to illustrate a little bit of what we're talking about is throw a question out there to you to get us thinking. And so the question that I'm going to launch with, and just to show you the interface here for the teacher, we could throw a question out that's multiple choice. We'll do that a little bit later. We could throw out a true-false question. We're going to start with a short answer. And the short answer question, which I've preloaded, hopefully here, is going to be coming to your desktop or your app momentarily. I'm going to allow for unlimited answers. And if I have done everything correctly, as a student, you should now see the question that you're seeing on the screen here that I see. What is required to make an assessment meaningful? So if you could take a moment to type in a response to that, and you can actually do this multiple times. Get some thinking out, talk with people if you're sharing this experience with someone else, or if you're on your own, just do some thinking in your own head. And when you've got something that you want to share, click on Submit an Answer. And then if a new idea comes to you, you can submit an additional answer. I'm going to flip over to the teacher side of things so you can see what a teacher would see if you were using this tool. And already we have 3. Thank you for that. And I'm going to keep the polls open on this for, we'll say, a minute or so, just to see how much we can collect. So we have planning, actionable output. The information is actually used to support and improve student learning. Provide diagnostic information to teachers and students. Prompt follow-up with the student. Congratulations to everybody who was able to follow all my directions and get in and do this. Assessment needs to involve feedback. Intent of use to be based on what is the goal of student learning. Clearly, the choir has arrived to be preached to. All right, I'm going to give you another moment or two to throw in any final responses. If I were doing this with a class, I might have this projected up on a smartboard or an Eno board or however you choose to share your computer or whatever device you're using. But I'll show you in a moment what we can actually do if I'm not choosing to do that, which is I can send these responses back to you. So to do this, I'm going to, as a teacher, click Start Vote, and what you'll then see on your device or on your browser is everything that has been submitted so far. And we might use this now to then read what everybody else had to say and perhaps respond by selecting a favorite of yours. So I'm going to start this vote, send this out to you. And now as a student, you should be seeing A through H for responses. My apologies if you were in the middle of submitting something and didn't make it into the poll. And if you see one or more than one item that is interesting to you, go ahead and click on that, and we'll see what kind of responses we get. And if you have a chance, you can flip back to my view of things and see what it looks like as people are submitting their votes. We have already a vote for an actionable output, prompt, follow up with students. I won't continue to read these. You can come over and take a look. Measurable results has, looks like 2 votes now. Now we have a couple that have more than 1 vote. I'm going to close the polling in a moment on this. Give you another second or two. And with 5 of 11 responding, make that 6. You can see briefly as you look at my teacher view, you can take a look and see. Right now, G, the information is actually used to support and improve student learning, has received 25% of the votes, and we have every one of the others receiving at least 1 vote. And so I could finish this off at one point and generate a report, or just go back to my dashboard. If I want to capture this data and have it sent to me, I could do that. I'm just going to click back on my dashboard, and we'll come back to that tool a little bit later. And I'm going to switch over now to full view and get us caught up to where we're at. So that's an example of a tool that we're using with kids and adults to gather information in the moment. So as I said before, I can't see or hear you right now, but I can at least remotely get some sense of where your head is at. And as I said before, clearly you have all chosen the right topic because you have some thinking about this already. We are a UBD district here in Concord, and we operate with enduring understandings. So here's what our enduring understandings are for our brief time together. Assessment should not get in the way of learning. It should be a part of the learning. If we go back to the Cheshire Cat talking with Alice about this notion of knowing where you want to go, a rephrasing of this is if you don't know where you're going, then any road will get you there. And that's a creed that we live by here. It's important as teachers and as students that we know where we're headed, or else you may not know when you've arrived anywhere. Yogi Berra said it like this: if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So that's our theme for the day, is knowing the target and then constantly responding to wherever students are around that target. Our enduring understandings can be rephrased in terms of these big ideas, and we're going to unpack each of these in a moment. I know our theme is science, and I will make every attempt to connect to science. Science is a passion of mine, especially at the elementary level. I do have an example a little bit later that is a math example, but I think you'll be able to immediately draw the connections to your work with students around science. So our big idea is we've got to know where we're going, what it takes to get there, and most importantly, how to make the necessary corrections when we veer off course. So that's where we're headed today. We've done a lot of work with Wiggins and McTighe here in Concord. Their way of framing it is that oftentimes our practices collapsed into this notion of teach, test, and hope for the best. I don't know about you, but this is how we were taught in undergraduate work. That you teach, 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 teach for some length of time, test at the end, and do a post-mortem as to how your students did, and then you move on from there. By contrast, what we're talking about now is teaching for understanding. And to do that appropriately, you need to make every attempt to regularly stop and check for that understanding, to figure out where it is that your students are at. Rick Stiggins, one of the demigods of assessment and learning, along with Wiggins and McTighe, says it like this, and this is a pretty powerful statement. You can enhance or destroy students' desire to succeed in school more quickly and permanently through your use of assessment than any other tools you have at your disposal. I don't know about you, but every time I read that quote, it scares me a little bit. It really speaks to the power of assessment, and I think that we can look at this two ways. Optimistically, we can hunker down and figure out what it means to assess the right way, do it well, pay attention, and be purposeful about it, and really the payoff can be amazing. Conversely, if we don't pay much attention to it, we can do some damage. We spent a fair amount of time with another consultant from Canada who has come down and worked with us a couple of times over the years. And if you have any opportunity to check out her website, her blog on assessment, Connect to Learning, her name is Anne Davies. And she really was, for many of us here in our district, instrumental in changing our thinking about how we respond to kids and how we teach kids and how we build assessment into the everyday teaching that we do. She speaks to this notion of assessment as learning, not as a separate entity, and that the more that we're assessing for learning and the more that that happens, the more that learning happens. Conversely, the more that we're spending time assessing learning itself, the assessment of learning, the more that students who struggle will be interrupted and will learn less. We're talking here about the formative assessment piece in the second bullet versus the summative assessment piece. We're going to unpack those ideas of formative and summative a little bit later with an analogy that might help clear this up. But ideally, we have to assess summatively. We know this. We're in the throes of Smarter Balanced right now here in our district. And we certainly know that it can disrupt our schedule, but we also know that there's some payoff for this. We have to see where our students are at, get a sense of how we're doing. Teachers at the teacher level, at the school level, at the district level, we know this. But if assessment is only summative, if we're not assessing along the way, if we're not assessing for learning, then we're really interrupting learning. We're getting in the way. Anne also speaks to this notion of the students need to be involved, and that as much as they're involved in this work, as much as they are key players in this, as much as they feel like it's not something that's being done to them, the more payoff there'll be. She adds to that notion that it's key that the students know the learning destinations and that we need to be explicit about those. We'll talk more about that in a moment. We have a process, and there are a couple of resources I'm going to give you a heads up about in a moment that would help unpack these ideas of setting goals and defining criteria and providing feedback. She speaks a lot about the ideas around goal setting and criteria setting together with the students. We'll unpack that in a moment, and I'll give you some examples of how that might look in a science classroom. And then lastly, teachers should provide opportunities for students to show their proof of learning, and that everything that we're asking those students to do is evidence. It's information that we're going to use, and we're not always necessarily going to use it in the same way. Not everything is graded, not everything's going to get feedback, but that we're mindful that we're never asking students to do something that's unnecessary, that there's always some purpose to it. So let's unpack this big idea from before. Meaningful assessments require first that we know where we're going. And so a strategy for this is to provide the students with a clear and understandable vision of the learning target. So there's this notion that we post our goals on the wall. We may even take a version of the standards and craft them into student language, student-friendly language, and put those up on the wall. And I've seen as an assistant principal, and frankly I've done it as a teacher myself, plenty of examples of teachers, myself included, who have fooled themselves into thinking that just putting it up there means that we're being focused together collectively on the goal. And by posting these up on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, that we're meeting this need. And it's so much more than that. So taking an example from an STC unit, electric circuits, I taught this in 5th grade a number of times. Digging back through the teacher's manual, we have some goals, some skills, some content embedded within the unit. Here are just 3 examples of wiring a simple circuit and predicting and observing and describing and drawing some conclusions. So the first thing we might think about is, well, what are these terms, these ideas, these skills, this content mean to students? If for any reason it is not something that they understand, then it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we can bring it down to their level. That I'm not just putting it up on the wall and pointing to them regularly, that they become instead part of what we're talking about on a regular basis with the students. The second two bullets in particular speak very closely to this notion of the science process skills. So one of the strategies I had in my own classroom when I was teaching is I created a bulletin board. I wasn't a fan of bulletin boards. I didn't want to change them on a monthly basis like my principal wanted me to. So my workaround for this was to put up a bulletin board of the science process skills, each one of them illustrated with images and with some language to go with each one. And I spent the first couple of weeks of science instruction in my class teaching each of the science process skills, from the easier ones like predicting and observing through the more complicated ones like generating an hypothesis and designing an experiment. And then my challenge for the students with everything that I taught in science was that I guarantee you I will not teach a science lesson at all this year that will not in some way incorporate at least one of these science process skills. And I challenged the students to keep me honest on this. And I even told them that I paid them $1 each if they could prove to me that what we did in science on any given day did not connect to these. And you know that not every lesson that you teach is a home run, and sometimes some tend to be a little more sedated and not as exciting as the labs that you might pull together or the engaging activities that involve manipulatives. And a couple of times, once in a while, the students would challenge me and they would suggest that I didn't. But invariably, we would talk through the science process skills and we'd find them embedded in the lesson somewhere. I never had to pay that $1. Very proud to say. So we make it clear to the students what the learning targets are. And then we figure out what it takes to get there. This is a process that involves what Anne calls co-constructing criteria, using examples of work, both strong and weak, to build a picture of what it looks like to do something well. So once we know where we're headed, we've got to know what it looks like when we get there and what it takes to get there. So the resources that I referenced earlier, each of these is a mini book. They come together as a collection of 3. You can pick them up at connect2learningmembers.com. I am in no way connected to them. I don't get any kickback from them. I can just tell you as a user that these books for me were instrumental as a teacher, particularly the first 2, setting and using criteria and self-assessment and goal setting. One of the things I did when I was teaching 5th grade most recently is I spent the early part of the school year teaching students what feedback meant. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what that looked like. And a lot of what I got from these books came from this middle one, this orange one, self-assessment and goal setting. And there's a lot of information in there around what good feedback looks and sounds like. And I'll tell you the rest of that story in a minute. So we go back to our example unit, STC, electric circuits, and the learning goals that we've talked about. And we think about, all right, so if we want to construct some criteria around what it looks like to meet these goals, then what does that entail? There's a procedure for this, a 5-step process. Again, this is illustrated in one of those 3 books. And it begins by you begin by just looking at some examples of student work. Ideally, perhaps it's a collection from a previous year or from another teacher. Or at least you're doing your best to protect the anonymity of the students by not including student names. You just want to look at work. Sometimes you can cheat the process and just make up some stuff too as a teacher and make up a range of things. Here are some good examples. Here are some not so good examples. And so then you ask the students a simple question. What are the characteristics of a quality blank? Whatever the example is, whatever it is you're having them look at. And as they look at those examples, have them write down on Post-it notes some qualities, some characteristics of what good such and such looks like. One idea per Post-it. They do this individually first. We've done this with teachers and with students. And then as the ideas pile up in the middle of the group, the students individually then share within their group some of these ideas. And they start to sort these characteristics into categories. Ultimately, these categories turn into some sort of qualitative statements, ideas around what quality looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. And within these categories, you might use some of the ideas from the Post-its to generate a bulleted list. If you're thinking ahead, you get this notion of what we're eventually building here is a rubric. It doesn't necessarily have to turn into a rubric, but you definitely have laid the groundwork for one here by following this process. So thinking back to our example and going to this notion of building, building some ideas around circuits, electric circuits, and specifically around the skill of drawing some conclusions. So I might present some samples of some work around what it looks like for students who have drawn some conclusions around some electric circuits that they have observed or created. And so the individual students, depending on the grade level, might generate some ideas like you see in red. The conclusions should reflect the hypothesis, for example. It should be measurable based on observation. And so this is where the teacher plays that ever important role of guide who is open to ideas but also quietly injecting his or her own along the way, paying close attention, because ultimately, teachers, we have to have this clear picture in our mind of what quality looks like. We can leave it to the students, and they may hit the mark in some cases, but they may miss some key points. This idea of co-constructing is that we're building it together. And you have to have a culture for this. You have to make sure that the students understand that you're going to value their ideas, but they're also going to have to understand that you may inject your own thinking on this. So as much as it can be a true co-construction, that's great. And teachers, depending on how kind of relationship you have with your class, you can either be a little bit more heavy-handed in terms of making sure you have certain ideas that make it into the list versus perhaps being more subtle about it and making sure that some of those ideas are represented somewhere. Ultimately, though, we want to make sure that we're all talking the same language in terms of what quality looks like. So we move on to step 4, and we start to categorize these statements, these qualities, these characteristics. And as we start to pool together a few, we might generate some qualitative statements. For example, a relative conclusion or relative statement must be based on results. And from the Post-its, we've gathered some ideas around it being measurable, being relevant, and based on observations. And then perhaps a second category might be that they're clearly articulated in some way, and that it's so clearly articulated, like we always say to our students, we want to make sure that it can be understood by someone else, that it can be replicated by another scientist or understood by another scientist. And so what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, you have a clear statement that it's free of opinion and guesswork, that it's all based on what's there. So ultimately, you've built this criteria together as to what it is that you're expecting, what it's going to look like. So we use this, we talk through it, and we're constantly then referring back to this criteria as the teaching and learning happens. And the last piece of that 3-part process that we referenced earlier, knowing where you're going, knowing what it looks like when you get there, and then lastly, knowing what to do when you veer off course. Teachers by design, we've been trained to do this, I think it's fair to say. We got into this business either because we like being with kids, we have a connection to younger people, we just interact better with them. I know that's the case for me. But also we just like to teach. We like to do and say things to make that light bulb light up. So the piece that often is missing, though, is we're not paying attention to where that's breaking down, and we're not making those mid-course adjustments. I don't know about you and what the expectations are in your district, but for me, when I was first teaching in my home district where I grew up, our principal expected me to turn in my plan book every week. And the expectation was that that made it to his desk Monday morning, and he would spend his entire day on Monday reading through teachers' plan books and giving his version of feedback along the way. And often feedback was in the form of a signature, perhaps a question or two, and he would turn it back into us at some point on Monday, and the expectation was that if he came in at any point during the week and flipped open our plan book and listened and watched what was going on, that there would be some match. You said you were going to be doing this on Thursday at this time, and I'm expecting to see that. That's all well and good. But the flaw in that design is that by Thursday, I'm not necessarily going to know where my students are at. And if I'm truly responding to them as learners, if I'm truly responding and giving feedback along the way and making those mid-course adjustments, then I may not know exactly where I'm going to be on Thursday. And I need to be prepared for that. So when I returned to teaching a few years ago, I made the conscious decision to make sure that I didn't do anything a week in advance. I made sure I would plan my units and get a sort of a general idea of what was expected over the course of a month, whether it was the electric circuits unit or something in reading or social studies. Yes, I would have a sort of a vague picture with goals and objectives built in. But as far as knowing where I was going to be 5 days down the road, I made a plan instead that involved doing my lesson plans a day or two in advance. Because invariably by Wednesday, we were someplace I didn't expect I'd be. And I needed to make sure that I was responding to where the learners were at. Keeping in mind, we had a goal in mind, but also knowing that they aren't necessarily going to get there as expected. So the key to this is feedback, or as Anne Davies calls it, feed forward. And it's this notion of not just giving some sort of affirmation of, hey, you did a nice job, but instead it's a reflection of what you did or did not do against that learning goal. So as I referenced earlier, one of the first things I taught my fifth graders is what good feedback looks and sounds like. And this was an investment that paid off in spades. I would spend the first couple of weeks just unpacking what feedback should sound like. I would give them good feedback and tell them why it was good. I would give them bad feedback and tell them why it was bad, to the point where I had trained my students to make sure that whatever came out of my mouth, and then ultimately whatever came out of their mouth, in terms of a reflection of what they had done, that it was useful feedback that they could use to improve what they were doing or to reflect on a success and know exactly what it was that they did that was successful. It wasn't about praise, it wasn't about blame. And periodically I would throw in an example of bad feedback, see if they were paying attention, and ultimately they would catch me, because I wanted to get to the point where they would demand more from me as a teacher. I wanted them to get to a point where they would say something to the effect of, I haven't learned anything from what you just told me. I need you to tell me something about what I did or didn't do that's going to help me get better. That's what feedback is supposed to be. And it's a key to this process. Grant Wiggins says that feedback is actionable data. Actionable in terms that you've got to just do something with it. He goes on to say far too many teachers give too much advice and not enough feedback. This is critical. So I wanted my students to know that at any time what I was going to tell them had some piece of information, very explicit, nothing hidden, that explained to them this is where the target was, this is where you're heading, this is how close to the mark you got, and this is what you need to do in order to get closer. So my whole grading procedure had changed. I tried to do away as much as I could with check pluses, check minuses, A's and B's, 95%, all of which provided no information for them. It was a very affirming system in many cases. Kids love getting A's, they love getting the top of the scale, but if they don't know why they got it, if they don't know how they got there, then it's information that's essentially useless to them. Not one for sports analogies, but I have to give credit where credit is due. And I think it's fair to say that football coaches and teams have sort of figured this out. This notion of using information to get better and differentiating between useful formative assessments versus not particularly useful summative assessments. So how many games in a typical football season at the high school level? Somewhere around 10 to 12, let's say. But behind that, how many practices are there? Now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50. And as Grant Wiggins points out, it's the learning that happens during the practices, during those formative assessments, during those times when the coach is paying attention to what the players are doing and responding accordingly, that gets them ready for the summative test, for the summative assessment, for the game, whether it's a regular old weekly game or whether it's a championship game. We've got to make sure that all the learning has happened during those practices. We need to make sure that the feedback's been given and that it's clear, and that if you're not hitting the target, here's what you need to do to hit it better, so that when it comes time for the game, the learning stops and it's time for the performance. It's the big show, it's the big game, it's the big test. So football players have figured this out, so have video games. Jay McTighe talks about the term dopamine squirt, a shot of dopamine that actually fires off in the brain when a student makes or a kid makes a connection while playing a video game. Kids will sit down for hours trying to get around the next corner, trying to get the next highest score, trying to defeat the big boss. And constantly what they're doing is they are responding to feedback. That's what video games are all about. Yes, we can say tons about how there's too much gore and how too much time is wasted, but when push comes to shove, it is a learning opportunity. And what makes that so engaging for students beyond the obvious entertainment value is that there is actually learning going on. And every time a student does something, or I keep saying a student, every time a child does something wrong, they immediately figure out what it was that they did wrong, and they change their course. And they get that little shot of dopamine in their brain, that little charge, that little rush that says, oh, if I try it this way instead, I may actually get a little bit further. That's what video games are about, getting a little bit further. Back when I was a kid, video games had no end. Now everything's a story. Everything has a beginning, middle, and end. And it really is a pretty good example of learning. If we can just turn learning in classrooms into an equally exciting prospect. All right, so let's go back to Socrative for a minute and get you guys engaged. So there's been a fair amount of research out there around what matters in terms of giving information back to kids. And so hopefully you've left your Socrative tab open on your browser, and I'll ask the question first and then I'll flip over to teacher mode and actually throw out the question. So you can't respond to anything quite yet, but let's explain the question first. So the research around what really matters to students, and the options are getting back a paper, for example, that's been graded only, getting back some piece of work that's both been graded and has some written feedback. And then the third option, option C, is getting feedback only. So in terms of what matters, what gives you the biggest bang for your buck, what will give you and the student that push forward to do better? Is it going to be A, graded only, B, graded and feedback, or C, feedback only? In other words, where do you want to put your time? So I'm going to open up a quick question. And as I said, hopefully you're still in as a student. I see that we still have 12 people in. Thank you for sticking around. And this one's going to be a multiple choice. This is a little confusing because we have 5 choices, A, B, and C are the only options we're going to use. So you can ignore D and E for now. And hopefully on the student side, you see something that looks like this, A, B, C, D, and E. So let me give you those choices again. What matters most? A is graded only. B is graded and feedback. And C is feedback only. We have 10 students who have responded so far. We have a split vote. Give another moment or two for a few more votes to come in. With 11 responses. Not sure if you can see what I see right now. All right, so I'm going to close it there. We have, if you flip over to the, back to the webinar, you can see what I see as a teacher. Nobody chose A. interestingly, and 55% of you chose B, that was the graded and feedback, and the rest of you, 45% of you, chose C, feedback only. So let's talk about A. Nothing but a grade. I agree wholeheartedly. It gives you no information whatsoever. It's, as we said before, it's an affirming system. Hey, I felt great about myself. I got an A. Hey, I feel lousy about myself. I got an F. And pretty much it ends there. No learning. So that leaves B and C. Grade and a feedback, and a slight majority chose this one. I can totally see why. And frankly, every time I've asked this question, typically this is the one that receives the most votes. We've talked about feedback. Hopefully you've gathered some new learning around how important feedback can be. So why not throw the grade in there as well? You get both pieces of information, more bang for your buck. Slightly fewer of you chose feedback only. So what the research says is that, and I'm going to close this, finish it off, go back to our presentation. What the research says is that it is actually feedback only that gives you the biggest bang for your buck. And think about it, as your experience as either a student or as a teacher, I remember clearly myself back in high school, if I had a teacher who was pretty prolific with that red pen and writing as much feedback as possible on my 10-page research paper, and I knew that on the back page I would find that final comment followed by the grade. As soon as that was handed out to us, I immediately, along with my peers, flipped to the back to find out what the grade was, and oftentimes would not even read the feedback. And even if I did, as we would hope any student would do, the fact that there's that judgment attached completely overshadows the value of the feedback. Oh, it's all well and good to tell me that I did this wrong and that right, but what it boils down to is I got a B+. Now, I know that it's heresy to suggest that we never grade anything. We all have report cards that we have to dish out at some point. There's an expectation that we provide some sort of report to both students and parents as to how our students are performing. But I would certainly endorse this notion of, as much as possible, going ungraded and using feedback only. Save the graded work for those summative assessments, for the big game, for the big show. When the learning has concluded and when you've done as much of it through feedback, and it's that opportunity now for the student to show you what he or she knows, save that. Save the grades for those situations. Everything else, as much as possible, if you can stick with only feedback, that's where the growing takes place. As Anne says, it's learning happening while you're assessing, and it's not getting in the way. So I'm looking at the clock, and I know that we have only 15 minutes, and there is a video clip that I want to make sure we have a chance to see. So I'm going to move quickly through the next few, and just to highlight as best as possible, for those of you out there using STC kits, you perhaps know that there is no shortage of assessment opportunities built into those kits. We've got pre- and post-unit assessments. Speaking back around the work of Wiggins and McTighe and their 6 facets of understanding, one of those facets is this notion of self-knowledge, and the idea that I can look at what I used to know and look at what I now know and reflect on that. That is a way of showing understanding. And so built into those kits, built into hopefully anything that you do, is this idea of giving students an opportunity to show what they know up front and then what they've gained at the end, and then reflecting on that. Where did that growth come from? Where did that new understanding come from? And giving students an opportunity to reflect on that is important. There are embedded assessments along the way. I did find in one of the teacher's guides this great quote that certainly supports everything that we're talking about today. And it's this notion of making sure that whatever you're doing, if there's an opportunity to turn it into some sort of an assessment, take that opportunity, which can be super challenging, science teachers, especially if you're trying to juggle a class of 25 students who are using tools and manipulatives, and there's fire or water involved, and all the while you're trying to be a scientist yourself and get around and observe how your students are behaving like scientists. I understand certainly that there is still a need to make sure everyone's safe, and crowd control and classroom management is always going to be there. But as much as you can take those opportunities to certainly demonstrate what good scientists do and gather information. What are you watching? What are you seeing? What are you observing as those students are behaving as scientists, and giving that feedback back to students is certainly important. I'm going to move through these a little bit more quickly. One of the things that, if you're an everyday math district like we are, if you know about that program, one of the things that they've built into their teacher's guide are these little stars along the way that highlight moments of assessments. So when I went and looked at the electric circuits unit, for example, and looking at the sequence of lessons, there are opportunities all over the place for assessment. And the question then is what are you expecting of students? And like we said earlier, making sure that it's clear to students and making sure that the criteria is equally clear. Such assessments permit, and this comes from the teacher's guide as well, an examination of process as well as products. We referenced earlier the science process skills. We know that process is such a big part of what it means to think like a scientist, to act like a scientist, to do science. It isn't just about the written lab report. It isn't just about some sort of written product. It is as much about the doing of science. And so your challenge is to make sure that you're paying attention to both. So much of what we're asking our students is often product-based only. And with science, perhaps more than any other, perhaps challenged only by writing, I would say. In that writing is a process through and through, and you're constantly revising and responding to feedback along the way. Science is so much like that as well. You can't just demonstrate your understanding of science by generating a written product. It's so much about action, and so much about thinking, and so much about behaving. And then within the kits, you've got formative and summative assessments as well. The analogy I promised you a little bit earlier is this. It's the garden analogy. And summative and formative assessments are rarely confused, but what I like about this analogy is it reminds us of the power of formative assessment. And while I promised myself I wasn't going to read too many of these slides, I will read this one. So if we think of our children as plants, a summative assessment of the plant is the process of simply measuring. It might be interesting to compare and analyze measurements, but in themselves, these do not affect the growth of the plants. As we said earlier, summative assessments aren't about learning. They're about a measurement of change. Formative assessments, on the other hand, is the equivalent of feeding and watering the plants appropriate to their needs, directly affecting their growth. Formative assessment is one of those edu-terms, I think perhaps more than many, more than most, perhaps even more than all, that is woefully abused and miscategorized and oftentimes used to describe things that are anything but formative assessment. Yes, it's all well and good to collect information in the moment, but if you do nothing with that information, then formative assessment has been thrown out the window. It is not merely enough to collect. You've got to do something with it. And so how do you collect, and then what do you do with it? So a couple of options. We have student response systems. We used Socrative already. Perhaps some of you have used clickers in the past. We've actually sort of moved away from those as we've picked up more personal devices here in our district with iPads in pretty much all of our schools. Socrative, just to give it one more plug, is completely free. So your homework assignment from me when this webinar is over is to go back to that browser page where you have it bookmarked or where you have it saved and launch an account because it is a tool that you can invariably use as a teacher. And being completely free, I think you'll find that it's a pretty cool tool with no cost involved. Speaking of very little costs, you have index cards. And what we're going to show right now with the time that we have left, I think we can still do this, Kyle, is a quick video that actually comes from a math class, middle school math class. So I know that this is supposed to be about science. I'm going to ask you to shift a bit in your thinking, but certainly keep that hat on. This has been a game changer, this particular video of our that we've watched. It doesn't come from us, but it comes from the teaching channel. And it's a phenomenal example of what a teacher does to gather information on a regular basis and then immediately do something with it. It is true formative assessment, and what we're trying to do is spread the good word of what that should look like in classrooms from K all the way to high school. And this is a fine example of that. So as you watch this example from that math class, think about what it could look like in your science class. Kyle, are you ready to take over and show the video?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Leah Alcala. I teach 8th grade math, and this is my warm-up routine that I do with my students almost every day. I call it my favorite no. Okay. Good morning, you guys. Your warm-up is on the board. I'm going to hand out your index cards. I put a warm-up problem on the board, hand out index cards to all the kids, have them write their answer. I collect it, and then I sort it, and I say yes, no, yes, no. And I look for my favorite wrong answer or my favorite no, and we analyze that. 4 minutes to work on it. Everyone makes mistakes. We're going to see your mistakes, you're going to see my mistakes. But a mistake is your opportunity to share with me how much you understand. And if I don't know that you don't know something, I need to teach you before the test. The test is too late, and this is a great spot for me to teach you. Make sure your name is on your card. Put your pencil in your pencil slot and pass your cards. I started my warm-up routine to replace clickers that a lot of classes are buying. So that was a clicker for each student. You ask a question, they lock in an answer. And then you look at your computer screen and you know what percentage of your students understand the problem. Well, we didn't have the money for that, so instead, okay, here we go. I thought, well, what if I gave everyone index cards, collected them real quick with their answers already written on it, and then I can just sort them as quick as possible and find out what percentage of my kids know the answer. No? Yes? Plus 40 cents instead of $15,000. Yes, so we have quite a few yeses and some very interesting no's. 1, 2, 3. I then took that a step further, something I couldn't do with clickers. 7. Look at the ones who are getting it wrong. How far are they from getting it right? And showing that work to the other kids. Okay, my favorite no. Someone wrote this. I say it's my favorite no because I want the kids to first of all recognize what they're about to see is wrong. And I want them to recognize that there's something good in the problem. Like there's a mistake, but it's my favorite no because it showed some good math. So that's the wrong answer. But they did some things that I love. What in that problem am I happy to see? We always talk about what's right first, so that if it's any student's work, they are like, oh, I did do that right. There's a mistake, but the mistake didn't ruin the whole thing. What do I like about this problem? Gavin?
Well, they distributed both with the 4x and the -2.
And today's lesson was on factoring, so I needed to make sure they understood how to distribute. They distributed, and what lets you know that they distributed? David?
How there are no more parentheses.
There are no more parentheses, and they didn't stop the parentheses. So they're asked to distribute a term with a variable. They're asked to distribute twice they're asked to distribute a term with a negative sign, which is often a very common mistake that kids make. And my students do not. Like, I have 3 years of CST data now to show that one mistake my students do not make is distributing a negative, which is amazing because they used to all the time. Distributing -2 to -6 is +12. And that was one mistake I was absolutely looking for and I did not see, which made me very happy. Not until the very end, as we've gone over different sections of the problem that are right, that I will then ask, okay, now what is incorrect? What does this person not understand? Where's the mistake? If I get a third of my class raising their hand, ready to tell me the mistake, it's pretty high engagement at that point. Yeah?
Like 4x times 2x equals 8x squared.
Very nice. This 4x times 2x multiplies to 8x squared. Can someone convince me of that? How do we know that 4x times 2x is 8x squared? My low-level students are very engaged. They feel like they're not getting penalized for being wrong. They're not being made fun of. I'm not looking at them. There's no peer pressure at this point. But they're like, wow, that's my mistake. And now I understand. It's very comforting. I mean, I feel very with my kids at all times. I'm not surprised by what they don't know. They're not surprised by what they don't know. It's how it should be. It creates more of a dialogue with me and them.
Thanks, Kyle.
Sure.
So you're going to turn the reins back over to me?
Awesome.
Great. So, again, I realize that's a math example. I'll show you what we did in a science class recently connected to that idea. Hopefully you picked up some good strategies there. I apologize that the video quality was a little shaky. Kyle and I practiced this the other day, and it's either his bandwidth or mine, or I'm not sure what, but it is a little shaky. I can tell you, though, the clip is easy to find. My favorite no on the teaching channel. I would highly encourage you watching it a couple of times. Personally, I've watched it maybe 25 times myself, and I pick up something new each time as I watch it. It's that good. So what are we doing with this notion of entrance/exit tickets? For me, when I was teaching, I didn't use exit tickets as much as I used a ticket in the door. Our day would start usually with a morning meeting, but to get to the morning meeting, you had a question to respond to. So back to our electric circuits unit, I might have a picture of a circuit drawing that will either light or not light a light bulb, and their challenge is to, on an index card, explain what will happen and why, and that was their ticket to come into the meeting. And as the meeting started, I could, as you saw in the video, flip through and get a sense of where my students are at. What do I have to reteach, or where are we okay as we go into the next lesson? So it's an opportunity to gather some information. Recently in an 8th grade class, I was working with a teacher just a couple of weeks ago, and she had issued a 6-question exit ticket at the end of a week. The first 5 questions were multiple choice, not particularly insightful in terms of evidence there, but the 6th question was an open-ended question, and it was really revealing in terms of where the students were at regarding their thinking. The question that the teacher had asked actually was a challenge to describe how a convection current works. And so she and I flipped through the responses, teased out, I think, 8 or so of them, retyped them, similar to what you saw in the video, so we don't see actual student work and we protect the anonymity of the students. But word for word, retyped what students had to say, and then went back the next day and presented those to the students and said, okay, well, here's what 8 of you said, and gave each student individual student time on their own to think about those responses, to react to those responses, and then small group time, and then ultimately as a large class, similar to what you saw on the video. What the teacher learned from asking these questions is that a fair number of kids were off the mark. So this was an opportunity, in a sort of my favorite no way, to respond to where the students were at and launch into a new learning opportunity around that concept. She knew right away she had to reteach it, but in this case, we're launching from where the students are at, using their understanding, and then building on that along the way. Whiteboards, perhaps you've seen or used them yourself, as we saw earlier, fairly inexpensive. I was in a high school classroom last night, in fact, and I saw something I'd never seen before. And I snapped a picture of it. I just thought it was the coolest thing. It's like a ping pong paddle of sorts. That's a whiteboard with a marker built in. And so I thought I'd share that along the way. And then, of course, there's the ever-present popsicle sticks. And if you think for any moment that this is only a strategy that's appropriate for elementary schools, particularly primary schools, please think again. If you don't have a place in town to buy these student-shaped popsicle sticks, order them online. Whatever you do, give the kids a chance during that first week of school to decorate those, to personalize those, stick them in a cup somewhere, and use them as much as you can. I, as a teacher, rarely ask students to raise their hands. Rarely called on students without choosing a stick first. They knew that in order for me to engage in their understanding, to ask a question, that I was going to go to the sticks first. Those sticks were at my side at all times. Ultimately, this keeps everybody on their toes. Admittedly, once in a while, I might fish for the right stick if I needed to move things along, or I might choose a stick and then choose again if I knew that I needed to protect a student. But 95% of the time, it was up to the student, whoever got chosen, to move the conversation along, to do something as we're learning together. Ultimately, this was probably the most powerful tool that we had to keep engagement up and to keep that opportunity going at all times to get a sense of where students are at as they're learning. So ultimately what we're talking about is a shift here, a shift in thinking as teachers from what do we want to teach them to what do we want them to learn. So I know I've gone over in time, and I apologize for that. If there is an opportunity to ask questions, Kyle, I'll turn this piece over to you if we want to do that. I'm happy to respond to anything that's out there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to flip it back over to my screen. And thank you, Chris. That was a great presentation. As you said, we did go a few minutes over, but we do have some time for questions and answers if the audience would like to submit them through the questions feature, and we'll respond to them as time will allow. While people consider that and maybe enter some questions, I thought I'd make a note that STC, the curriculum that Chris was referencing, is the curriculum that we publish. It stands for Science and Technology Concepts, and it's a really great curriculum. If you would like to get some more information about it, there's more about it on our parent website, which is on your screen now, and the website for the Laser Eye 3 project of the Smithsonian Science Education Center is above that. So it looks like we don't actually have any questions that have come in right now. We can wait a hair longer. Okay, so it looks like, Chris, you just covered it all. So we'll wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, for attending and participating. I also want to thank Chris very much for his great presentation and sharing his passion and expertise with us. And Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kyle.
And again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our website within a few days. Our sixth and final I3 teacher webinar will be on literacy tool use as an integral feature of students' sciencing, and will take place on Tuesday evening, May 5th. Finally, when you exit the webinar, you'll be directed to a very short survey. We greatly appreciate your feedback, and I'm sure Chris would as well. And we appreciate your taking a small amount of time to respond to those couple questions. If for some reason it does not pop up in your browser when you exit the webinar, it will also be included in the follow-up email sent by GoToWebinar tomorrow evening. So thank you again for attending, and have a great evening.
Am I allowed to give myself feedback?
Yes, you are, if you wish.
I've got some thoughts.
All right, good night, everyone.
Good night.